G'day, welcome back to the Feral Garden. My name is Konrad, and today we're going to look at what happens if the power fails in my aquaponics garden. Stay with me and I'll show you my backup plan. Ever since I've set up the aquaponics system here in the Feral Garden, one question has always come up, and that is, what happens if the power fails? Now, I've seen plenty of systems online where the power, when it fails, unfortunately causes the fish to die. So what I knew I had to do was come up with a backup plan to make sure that that didn't happen here. My original aquaponics system was based on 12 volts, but unfortunately I couldn't get it to run 24/7. I eventually bit the bullet and bought myself a 240 volt pump, and since then really the aquaponics hasn't looked back. But what happens if that pump either fails, or what happens if the power goes out? I needed to have a backup plan. Luckily I had some old camping gear around. This started a few years ago when I was putting together a camping trailer, and what I thought I'd do is use the leftover bits from that camping trailer and set myself up a little backup system. So come and I'll take you with me and show you how I've set up a little system that keeps the fish alive if there is ever a power failure. So we'll start the tour here looking at my garden shed. The first thing you'll notice on the roof is an old pair of solar panels. This is what I used to take camping, and it's 120 watts. Not a lot by today's standards, but it was pretty good back then. And what I've done is I've added a couple of angle iron braces to it and screwed it onto the roof. Now the power from that particular solar panel, you can see the little conduit goes into the shed. Now I'll take you into my little garden shed over here, and the conduit comes through up the top, makes its way down. You can see an Anderson plug there because that's how I used to connect it, so I still use the Anderson plug connector. And the first place that power comes into is my DC to DC charger. This is again the one I used to take camping. It's actually the same one that's in our camper trailer at the moment. That provides a charge to my battery. You can see the power then comes out of the DC charger, works its way down, and it comes down to this large battery box down the bottom. This battery box is the same one I used to take. I used to have to lift it in and out of our camper trailer, and rather than leave that battery lying around, it now sits here in my shed and powers everything that is 12 volts. Now the power from that nicely stored up energy then comes through a switching system. You can see the whole lot of cables coming up here. Some of those cables then come into this little switching system over here. This is just a marine switch that I put together. I got an old box, cut the front off it and then screwed it to it, and it's set up inside. Has switches on it. All I have to do is turn the switch. That's my light switch. There's my music. We don't need that running at the moment. There's up the top some USBs. This runs this little fan. Just can have a little fan in here, so we have all the luxuries we need. Just turn the fan on, there it goes. But the main idea of this system wasn't just to run 12 volts here in the shed. It was also to be able to run a pump, an air pump, and also a water pump if we needed it, for the aquaponics system. If you have a look over here, you'll see the last one. This one's turned on. There's the actual pump. Didn't have a pump icon, so I used the little tap one. And that runs out of my system over here, up here into this little timer. This is a 12 volt timer. It's actually set on manual at the moment. I'll put it on in a minute so we can actually see the pump in action. But it can be set up for 18 different times for it to turn on and off. I've got it set up 3 times. It turns on at 9 o'clock and off at 10, 12 and turns off at 1, and 3 and turns off at 4. So it's adding air even if the pump doesn't need it. I also have plenty of protection. I've got fuses everywhere. I've got a fuse box over here. There are fuses also built into the inside of this particular unit. And I also have a fuse set up over here. I'll just show you quickly. This is a resetting fuse, exactly what you'd have if you had an automotive system. So just in case something goes wrong. So what I've got set up at the Aquaponics is a 12 volt pump, an air pump. I'll show you that in a moment, but I'll turn it on first. This is set up as manual, so it's actually turned off at the moment. If I press the little manual button over here, you can probably hear in the background the pump is now turned on. So let's go and have a look at that pump before we come back into the shed. So over here at the back of the aquaponics system, down here is where I keep the air pump. It's higher than the actual water, and the reason for that is so that it can't auto siphon if there is a failure in the lines. It actually has 6 outputs. You can see the different outputs. I actually have 2 of those doubled up, so I have only 2 of them in operation. And what I have connected them to is air stones. I'll bring one of those air stones up for you to have a look at, and there it is there. You can see the air stone, and that's where the air goes through and bubbles away quite madly. So what I'll do, at the moment it is turned off, what I'll do is I'll turn it on so you can see how much bubbling there is actually there. So let's go around to the front. At the moment you can see there is bubbles in there. That's because it's a constant venturi running all the time. But I'll go and turn it back on and we'll have a look at how much the fish get annoyed by the bubbles when the air compressor is working. The compressor is now working, probably hard to hear over the top of it. And you can see the bubbles coming up from it. It does that 3 times a day for an hour. Just gives a little bit of extra oxygen to their system. But in the case of a failure, it can go 24/7. So what are the considerations you might need if you want to put a system like this together, and is it for everybody? Well, the first thing is you do need to have some skills in being able to solder, and I've heat shrunk all of the different connections, as you can see over here, to make sure there is no overload. I've actually made sure there are plenty of fuses in place. They're all 20 amp fuses for the main, but there are some 15 amp for some of the simpler things like the stereo. There are also 2 fuses inside this particular box. One fuse is for the top section, which is the 12 volt and for the voltage display, and the other fuse is for the switch gear down the bottom. I still have 1 spare that I haven't used yet. I don't know what I'll use that for, but I'm sure it's always better to have 1 extra than to have 1 short. The other thing is, do you have these things lying around? I mean, if they're lying around, you might as well put them to use. I was originally going to put 240 volts into this shed, but the cost was pretty prohibitive. So for the cost, probably, I would say all the bits and pieces together under $100, I was able to at least have voltage in here. I can actually go and even charge things. You can buy 12 volt charging units. This particular unit over here is used with a Ryobi system. It plugs in with a cigarette lighter. I can then plug that into my battery, take one of my rechargeable batteries and recharge it in the shed. That's quite handy. The other thing you need to do is make sure you set it up properly. Make sure you know where your positives and negatives and everything is. As I keep saying, I'm lucky I have an engineer for a son. He keeps me honest. He tells me the things I'm doing wrong, even though I still question him. I normally carry out what he says. He didn't like this is all the negative, and he didn't like that being done. He said that should have been done on the positive terminal, but I explained to him I had fuses in here and he was quite happy with that. So I hope you like that little look at my backup plan. The thing I can do, I still have some 12 volt pumps from my original system. If I wanted to, I can actually have a quick connector, I can disconnect it, and I can run the pumps as well if I want to keep my system going. I also have a spare battery, so if that battery for some reason discharges, I can actually change the battery over as well and keep the system running till hopefully the power comes back on. It's not a system for everyone, but it's certainly one that I'm quite happy having here. It just gives me a little bit of peace of mind. So far we haven't had to use it, but I have plans in the future where I can actually, hopefully next year when I set up a hydroponic system in summer, what I can do is I can use that same system to get a Dutch bucket system up and running. But that's something for a later video. So I hope you've enjoyed this little look at the feral garden and my backup plans, and I'll see you again next time.